Let's go ahead and get into the word. I will tell you, it seems like I haven't preached since I was in my 30s. And so, all right. I only get to say that one time. You better believe I'm going to throw that one out there. All right. You better believe I'm going to throw that out there. Well, we have been in a series, and in fact, we are wrapping up that series this morning. We have been looking at being altered at the altar. And in my opinion, it's been a great series. It has been a great series. It's been a challenging series, at least for me. And there's one thing I discovered about 2 weeks or week 2 into this is that this series is not for the faint of heart. I didn't think it was going to be this challenging of a series and this kind of in your face of a series, but it really turned out to be. And you guys are here this morning, week 4 of Altered at the Altar. Kudos to you. We are examining the concept that the change that we want in your life or that we desire in our life is found at the altar you make. The altar is important. And in fact, in our first message of the series, we examined the question, do you know about the altar? Do you know about this special place that you are able to have in your life? It could be a closet. It could be the foot of a bed. It could be the front seat of your car. It could be right here in this sanctuary, a special place where you are able to come and just to meet God and to look at that special place with a priority. And then we've been continuing on from there, looking at the specific altars that we are able to make. We have been looking at the life of King David and how he is an altar builder. He might not always have built physical structures. They were usually altars of practice and of mindset. And we have seen the altars he built, like the altar of repentance. We saw how he built the altar of repentance after he was confronted with his sin with Bathsheba and how he murdered her husband. And then last week we saw how he built the altar of sacrifice after he pridefully counted the people and he was being judged because of that. And his country was having the overall wrath of God because of his sin placed upon them. And he had an opportunity for a deal. And you know, Amazon Prime Day was this past week, and I got some good deals on a couple of things. David had an opportunity for a deal, and he passed up that deal. He said, I'm not going to sacrifice to God sacrifices that cost me nothing. Today, in our conclusion to the series, we're going to examine the altar David is most known for, the one he continually made throughout his life. We are going to be looking at the altar of worship. And for our scripture reading this morning, in fact, where we're going to be all day today in 2 Samuel chapter 6, we're actually journeying all the way back to the beginning of his reign. We have been decades into his reign at certain points of time within this series, but this morning we're at the very beginning, within the first year of him being king of the entire nation of Israel. I want to start off reading to you about 10 verses today, and then we'll get into the message here. We're going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 6. Let's start off in verse 12. So David went to bring up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. Wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord with all his might. While he and all Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with sounds and the sounds of trumpets, as the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window. And when she saw the king leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it, and David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. And then let's skip to verse 20. When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, how the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would. And David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house, whom he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people, Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more dignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in high honor." And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children from the day of her death. Let's talk this morning a little bit about the game changer. The game changer. Here we see David in worship, what he has always done and what he will continue to do throughout his reign. Even though at times he will mess up, kind of like what we already just briefly went over in our synopsis of the series, worship will be a staple and a tent pole of who he is. He will always remain true to this identity that he is a worshiper. And David has a lot to worship this morning. It has not been easy for David or for the Ark of the Covenant, for that matter. He has been living as a man on the run, just about. It's really not possible to say how long. The conservative estimates of how long he was running from his predecessor was roughly maybe about 8 years. 8 years of living in caves or hiding among his enemies. And once King Saul had died, David, he's anointed king of the tribe of Judah, but he still has to stay secluded from the remainder of the nation because Saul's son, Ishbosheth, initially took up the mantle of king of the remainder of Israel. But then when Ishbosheth died, that's when David became king of the remaining tribes. And then there's the Ark of the Covenant as well. And the Ark has been going through a lot too. The Ark should actually be looked at as a prominent character in our story here of 2 Samuel chapter 6. The Ark was originally constructed in the first year after Israel had been set free as slaves from the nation of Egypt. It was at the base of the mountain of Sinai that this chest was built of acacia wood and was overlaid with gold inside and out. And then the stone tablets that had been inscribed with the 10 Commandments from God by God's finger were placed inside. And the ark, more importantly than this chest, this piece of furniture, is actually the embodiment of the presence of God. The ark is the manifest presence of God among the people of Israel. Exodus chapter 25, verse 22, God says, "I will meet you there and talk to you from above the atonement cover." He's talking of the Ark of the Covenant. "Between the gold cherubim that hover over the Ark of the Covenant. From there I will give you my commands for the people of Israel." And it was the ark that they carried before them, the manifest presence of God that they carried before them, that gave them such victories, such incredible mountaintop experiences. Like when they were crossing the Jordan River out of the desert into the promised land, the people of Israel followed behind the ark because the ark went in beforehand into the Jordan River when it was in its flood stage. And the flow of the river was cut off and millions of people crossed over on dry ground. It was the ark that marched before them as they were beginning their conquest of the promised land. And they marched around Jericho. The Bible talks about how they marched one time per day for 6 days. And then on the 7th day, the ark preceded them and they followed behind the ark. And they marched around the city 7 times that day. And then when they let up a great big shout, and the walls of the city fell to the ground. All throughout their military conquests of the promised land, the ark proceeded before them. However, by the time of our main text this morning in 2 Samuel chapter 6, the Ark of the Covenant has been away from the people of Israel. It's been away from the tabernacle. It's been away from other places of worship. In fact, it has been missing from the focal point or the centralized location of Israel for roughly about 100 years. It was about 100 years before that the Ark was captured by the Philistine armies. And it's not because the Philistines were so much more powerful than the Israelites or because they were more powerful or capable to be able to do so. It's because that the Ark of the Covenant, God's manifest presence, God had allowed them to capture himself. In fact, the nation of the Philistines, when the Ark of the Covenant arrived on the battlefield in 1 Samuel chapter 4, They're crying out in fear. They're saying, oh no, the Ark of the Covenant is here. The God of our enemies is here. We're doomed. Who is going to deliver us from this? But yet they are still able to capture the Ark. But the Philistines didn't keep the Ark long. The Bible talks about how they only kept it 7 months. And then when they are having 7 months of trouble and trial because of the Ark, they return it back to the people of Israel. And it goes to a place called Kirith Jearim. And it's there for, the Bible talks about, for 20 years. But in all actuality, it never left that location. It remains there for the remaining 80 years up until this point, when David decides to bring the Ark of God to his city, the city of David, in his first year as king. And because he does this, he's doing this because if there's ever a time for him to worship God, it is right now. He is seeing the fulfillment of such incredible promises in his life. He has finally been made king over all of Israel, like he had been told he would be. He's making Jerusalem the capital of his kingdom. What was a relatively neutral city, he has conquered, and he is now making it his capital. And the Ark of the Covenant, that manifest presence of God that has been away from the centralized location of the people of Israel for 100 years now, he is bringing it back to center focus within the eyes of the people. There is cause for celebration. And so David, he's jumping around, he's dancing before the Lord, and he's participating in the fullest celebratory worship he possibly can, because he has been and always will be a worshiper. He worshiped God before he even went on the run from King Saul. In fact, when Saul was being driven insane by an evil spirit, he called in David, the man that he deemed a threat, but he knew that he was a worshiper. And as David played the harp, it said that the Bible talks about how such an incredible peace was brought upon Saul, because David is a worshiper. When David was in the caves and hiding among his enemies, he was a worshiper, uncertain what the next day would bring, hoping and believing that it would all turn out okay, but yet still not 100% sure if the next day he would be dead. He worshiped through it all. Today, I want to talk to you and tell you to embrace a lifestyle of worship. Not just because of the reason why David is right here in this given moment, because of the good things that are happening or the desirable things that are happening or the favorable things that might be happening to you, but embrace a lifestyle of worship, not because your life has changed, but so that your life will change. Worship is the game changer in the life of the believer. Worship changes the game when you are feeling depressed. Worship changes the game when you feel helpless. Worship changes the game when you are confused, or when you are hurt, or when you are lonely. Worship changes the game when you are anxious. Worship changes the game when you are running on empty and you've expounded all the energy and all the effort you can possibly give into any given situation. If you need a game-changing event in your life today, try building the altar of worship. As we talk about the altar of worship this morning, I want you to remember today that, in fact, the altar of worship can be practiced in a variety of different ways. The altar of worship can be practiced in how we give monetarily to God. I've always held to the viewpoint and preached the viewpoint that your gift to God, your monetary gift to God, is an act of worship to Him. It can be acted out and participated in how we volunteer our time. Like when we come out on the hottest day of the week, like Sister Christy said, most likely the hottest day of the year up until this point, and we give 8 hours of our time building a fence, that is an act of worship. Yeah, we laughed, we had fun, we sweat together, some of us cried a lot, but it was an act of worship all the same. The act of worship can be your verbal proclamation in your prayer time. The time that you spend honoring God and glorifying God and physically saying, God, I praise you, I worship you, I exalt you. Worship can be the musical time that you spend singing before him, like we just spent 30 minutes doing this morning. But no matter how you think of worship today, I want to tell you, if you're going to have worship being a game-changing event in your life, the way you embrace it is going to have to change. Worship cannot be a spectator event. Worship is about participation. Worship is about getting involved, getting in there, and doing it for yourself and not watching someone else. And as you do it, I guarantee you this morning, there are going to be 3 things you're going to want to know about building the altar of worship. And that's what I want to talk about here today. Let's look at those a little bit more in depth. The altar of worship, first of all, it must be treated with the utmost care. It must be treated with the utmost care. Worship needs to be treated correctly. When the Philistines first took the Ark of the Covenant, they did not know how to treat the Ark of the Covenant. They just took the Ark and they just stuck it in their own temples, right next to their own idol. In fact, the Bible talks about how when they went to bed at night, the presence of God would knock over that idol. And they'd come in the next morning and they would find their idol, the thing that they worshiped, that stone statue just lying there on the floor. And after 1 or 2 nights, they didn't get a clue. They just kept on picking it up and putting it right back. But I'll tell you what, after a few weeks or a few months of that, you would probably start taking a hint. Thus, they returned it to the people of Israel. Because Israel, though they might not always be consistent with it, they understand how to treat the altar of worship. What we read this morning in verses 12 through 20 is not the first time David attempted to bring the ark back home. He tried it once before and it didn't turn out very well. Check out these verses with me. 2 Samuel chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. It says, David again brought together all the able-bodied young men of Israel. There's 30,000 of them. And he and all his men went to Baalah in Judah. That is also could be Kirath Jearim. And to bring up the ark from there, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who was enthroned between the cherubim on the ark. They set the ark on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on a hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart with the ark of God on it, and Ahio was walking in front of it. David and all Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord with castanets, with harps, lyres, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals. And when they came to the threshing floor at Nakon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark because the oxen had stumbled. And the Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down and he died beside the ark of God. So if you're like me, and the very first time you started reading that verse, you might have been saying some things to yourself that didn't appear all too reverent to God. Because I must admit, I was kind of like, whoa, this feels like an overreaction. This really does. I mean, I know only the high priest is really the one that's able to touch the ark. But surely the common folk reaching out to stabilize the ark so that it doesn't topple over and fall off the cart is better than the whole thing rolling over on the ground. Surely that's a better option. Here's the thing. The issue starts long before Uzzah reaches out and touches it. The problem is the ark is not being treated with the utmost care, the utmost respect. The Ark of the Covenant, remember, it's the manifest presence of God among the people. And God does not want to be carted around on the back of a cart. In fact, the ark is specifically designed. It has these 4 rings that are attached to it and these 2 poles that have been overlaid with gold that go through the rings. And 4 Levites are supposed to be carrying around the ark. And I don't know if this is an oversight or laziness, but surely among 30,000 men, able-bodied men, David would have thought to seek out 4 Israelites to say, hey, maybe we should carry this. It's plain to see that this could be quite insulting to God. In David's time, worship, it is complicated. It's a complicated task. There's so many different rules, and certain people could only do certain things. And in the church age we live now, it doesn't come with this huge list of do's and don'ts. In fact, Jesus himself said that we have the opportunity to worship in spirit and in truth. And in fact, because of God's grace and his blood of his son, worship is really kind of a free thing that is open to interpretation, that we are able to talk about worship being of our time or of our money or of our hands lifted up or of song or of prayer. But one aspect of worship that will never change is that worship must be treated with the utmost care in our life. Worship must be respected as the sacred act that it is. We are giving to God what he is due him. We are bestowing upon him his worth, and we are proclaiming that over from our lives to him. And to treat God with the proper care, it must be a priority in my life, as well as a prominent attribute of my life. And so worship, as I examine my life, it might be something that is continually practiced, but as my life shifts and changes, maybe because of the circumstance, it needs to be tweaked from time to time so that it is continually operated in the proper care. How am I supposed to know whether I'm treating worship with the proper care or not? Well, I haven't fallen over dead yet, so maybe that's a good litmus test to examine our worship life this morning, to see if our worship life might need an overhaul today, whether I'm misprioritizing or underprioritizing. And we might need to ask ourselves a couple things. Am I choosing other things in the place of worship in my life? In a day filled with convenience and all this opportunity, does worship have the same opportunity as everything else that I give opportunity to? Because I know you guys aren't like this, but from time to time, I choose the wrong thing. Every now and then, I make the wrong choice, and I have to examine my life, and I have to tell myself I need to put worship back in its proper placement. Sometimes I take shortcuts through worship. I'm looking at my watch, I'm looking at my schedule, I'm looking at what I have to do throughout the day. And sometimes I take shortcuts through it, and I have to examine my life and examine my priorities and examine where my heart is and say, God, I need an overhaul in my worship. Sometimes my mind wanders during worship because there's things going on in my life. And I have more things going on than just taking the time, even for 30 minutes, to worship God. And so my mind is consumed with all the different things that are going on, all the different stress and anxieties, or even the good things of my life. And I have to re-examine my life and reprioritize worship. Sometimes we'll even be concerned with how other people think of us, and so we allow our worship to be hindered, limiting how we participate, limiting lifting our hands, limiting closing our eyes in this corporate environment because it's uncomfortable. But to be treated with the utmost care, worship always has to be first and in a right place in my heart. That kind of passion to worshiping rightly, it might rub other people the wrong way, though. And that'll bring us to the next thing we need to look at, that I need to know when I decide to build the altar of worship, is that the altar of worship will not always be understood by all. Because whenever you stand out, others are going to notice. And often those who notice will be your biggest critics. And sometimes they will be those that are closest to you. That's the way David saw and experienced this in his life. Michal is his wife, and she is his biggest critic in this time. Look again with these verses with me. As David and the ark were entering the city, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window, and when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. And when David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "How the king has been distinguishing himself today, going around half naked in full view of all the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would do." I'm going to take a position real quick that most of us don't usually put when it comes to examining the antagonist of this story here. Michal is not 100% wrong. She's not 100% wrong. On this day, David's not in the most modest of materials. I'm all for comfy clothes. I used to have a linen shirt. I used to have one. It was comfortable, but man, oh man, I better have a shirt underneath or make sure I'm in a dark room. Michal isn't exactly wrong when it comes to this. David dancing around, broad daylight. I don't know how it goes. He's there dancing around, broad daylight, doing his thing, and that thin white material, the sun gleaming through it, does not leave much to the imagination. And here's Michal. She's the daughter of the previous king. She understands some things that David might not quite understand. David, he's just a shepherd. I mean, David, he's just this ruddy old young man at this point. He's inexperienced in the proper way that royalty should act. So the way David is acting now from a standpoint of propriety, it is completely improper. From a standpoint of this way, Michal is not wrong. The king shouldn't be dressed this way. You don't see the Queen of England jumping around, not just because she can't anymore, but because it's not proper. Here is the issue with Michal's criticism. She's only a spectator. She's only a spectator. And remember, worship is never a spectator event. It is participatory. Worship isn't about propriety. Worship is about passion. And to say David is passionate and expressive in worship is an understatement. When you just focus on David's outfit and his dancing, and it's easy to skip over the passion. Like what happened in verse 13, how every 6 steps he's sacrificing a fattened calf and an oxen. 6 steps isn't long. I mean, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's an ox and a calf. Another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's another one. I don't know how far it is from that place that they started at until they got to the city of David, but I'm telling you what, it was a massacre for livestock that day. He's passionate and he's expressive in it. And then you add in how he leaps and he dances before the Lord, but he's celebrating because he knows it's not about being dignified. It's not about who will see and what they're going to think about him. Worship is about celebrating the one who chose us to be his own. Worship is about celebrating the one who has appointed you to carry out his will. Worship is about the one celebrating him who has brought you to this point into your life through the provision that he has given you, through the protection that he has given you, through the providence of his hand leading and guiding you all along the way. Worship is about stretching the boundaries of what I am willing to show and how I'm willing to show my love for him. And no matter how that makes me look, even to those closest to me. Because sometimes we don't care about how we look in front of a group of strangers, but the moment we'll get with family or those people that know us best, those people that know us from the deep on the inside and our nitty-gritty secrets, we get so reserved. We get so reserved when it comes to worship. Because when they look and they see how someone is acting different than the scope of which they deem as appropriate, and then they begin to chastise. And they begin to criticize, and they begin to complain. when those times happen, when you're passionate about worship, when it's not about being proper in it, but it's about truly expressing what it is that God has done and how you feel about that in your life. You're able to look about them and say, you know what, you might think it's rough now, but you haven't seen anything yet. And that's exactly what David tells his wife. Oh, you think it's bad now? I can get so much worse. Oh, I can get so much worse because I know what God has freed me to do. I know what I am made to do. I will worship undignified because I know I would rather look foolish before you than look foolish and unappreciative before my God. It will never be understood by all. But yet, when the altar of worship is built, the third thing that will happen is it will always elicit a response. It will always elicit a response. When we worship God for who he is, there will always be something that happens, and usually it'll be a twofold response from him. First, worship elicits a response from God himself to us. After Uzzah reached out and he tried to protect the ark and he was killed, David, he's upset and he's probably a little fearful and probably just uncertain. Should I have really even done this at this point? And so he sends the ark to just this random house. Maybe there was a volunteer of the 30,000 men that were with him that day. It doesn't say how the ark got there, just that it was there. In 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 11, it said it remained at the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household. And the Bible's not specific how his household was blessed, but just that their life was better because the ark was with them. When we worship, life will be better because of it. It will elicit a response from God because worship for God, worship that is genuinely about him, but it's poured out to him. But the amazing thing about our loving Heavenly Father is he will then pour out on us because of it. The beautiful act that's meant solely for him becomes something that's beneficial for us. Sure, we might not enter his gates and enter his courts with praise and with worship for what we can get out of it, even though I might need something in that very moment, but that does not mean that God does not pour out his all, that he does not transform or bless my offering of worship to him by providing me with the peace that I need in any given moment, by providing me with the joy that I might be needing in that time, by providing me with the hope that I need, or the encouragement I need, or most importantly, maybe the new outlook that I need. It's when we build the altar of worship that we will usually find that I will receive exactly what I needed, because the change that I want, the change that I need is found at the altar I make. And then the second response to worship is that worship will elicit a selfless response from within me. David, when he brought the ark back into the city of David, when it finally reached that tent that he had erected for it, the Bible says that once he had finished, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. And he gave them a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites. Both men and women and all the people went to their homes. Genuine, true, sacrificial worship will always result in me being more outwardly focused. It changes my outlook from internal to external, from what I need to what someone else's need. I will see people I might maybe have never seen before. I will notice people that I don't normally notice. I will empathize with their situation, and I'll even give freely rather than keeping to myself. This morning, if you find that maybe your life has just been just a little too inwardly focused, maybe the altar of worship is exactly what you need. It is a transformational event. As I worship the Father, I become more and more like him. It is a response working in me. It is a response working through me. As we close this morning, I am so compelled and driven by the thought worship is the game changer. This morning, I might not know exactly what it is that you're going through. I might not know exactly what it is that you are in need of today. But what I do know is that building the altar of worship daily is exactly what I need. It is the game changer. And I know this to be true because the enemy, he'll try to keep me from worship. He tries to keep me from worship so much. I mean, remember, and the enemy, Satan, Lucifer, he was described as the chief worshiper in heaven before the fall. And of course, he has just this insight, intimate knowledge of what worship has the power to do. And so if he can keep God's creation, if he can keep God's people from it, he will keep you from living in the fullness of what is available to you. Worship is the game changer. I've never been a fan of the phrase, fake it until you make it, especially when it comes to worship. Because God, he's not looking for fake people. He's looking for passionate, sold-out people. But sometimes a phrase that I think we need to get behind and a thought process that we need to get behind is sometimes you need to force it until you feel it. Sometimes your flesh isn't going to want to lift up your arms and worship and surrender to him. Sometimes your schedule is going to try to say, oh, you don't have time for that. Sometimes the people around you, they're not going to fully understand why it is you dedicate so much energy to worship. They might even be other Christians, other followers of Jesus. And the enemy is going to try to deter you from the power of worship. And it's in those times you just got to do it. You just got to do it. I know there's those of you in this room, you know that some of the most powerful times of worship that you've ever had, some of the most memorable experiences you've ever had, they came when you didn't exactly feel like doing it, but you got into the mode, you got into the rhythm, you got into the groove of it. And it might have took maybe 5 minutes, it might have took 50 minutes, it might have took 5 days, but suddenly there was something that was plowed in your life because you forced it until you felt it. And now you're fully invested, fully involved, fully ingrained. When I don't feel it, it's when it's time to press in even harder. Worship is the most important aspect of your walk. The last little thing I want to say about it is it needs to be planned and needs to be intentional. The Bible said that when David brought the ark back to the city of David, he had pitched a tent specifically for it. There was a plan in place before he even left. Worship needs to be planned. And more than just Sunday from 10 to 11:15 to 11:30. It needs to be an intentional step on your Monday, an intentional step on your Tuesday and into your Wednesday. And when you're feeling the victory of Thursday and Friday and the relief and the rest of Saturday, worship must be intentional. And if the change you need is found at the altar you're willing to make sure you don't skip the altar of worship today. This morning, with every head bowed and every eye closed in this place today,